Okay, welcome to EdPsych 501 Screencast 6, Part 1. So Part 1 is focusing on qualitative methods. Part 2 will focus on mixed methods. We'll be going through 4 topics: the characteristics of qualitative research, comparing qualitative and quantitative research, types of qualitative research, obviously, and then validity in qualitative research. So the characteristics of qualitative research, as established by Bogdan and Bicklin, which is a pretty reputable resource, are that qualitative research is about building meaning, generating understanding, and we are much more focused on process as opposed to outcomes or products. When you're in a qualitative world, you're in a natural world. You're immersing yourself either in large amounts of collected data or in settings themselves and actually becoming the instrument through which the data is collected. And then, of course, with qualitative research, data is much more inductively analyzed. So we're talking about building theories as opposed to testing hypotheses. And then finally, qualitative research is very descriptive in nature. So this is the point in every introductory research methods course where quantitative and qualitative methods are pitted against each other to set up a bias that you will have going forward for the rest of your life as a researcher to fit yourself into one of these categories. I'd like to start by adding the caveat that nothing is black and white. And so these next sets of slides are really for the purposes of learning and getting yourself initially immersed in the vocabulary of these two kinds of research methods. So they serve the purpose of expanding our vocabulary when it relates to each of these kinds of methods. And what that does is it allows you to understand where people are coming from and the kinds of comments that you might hear said about each kinds of research will become more understandable. And so, again, it's useful when you're being introduced to a topic to basically see how they compare and contrast. However, it's dangerous to assume that these are opposite ends of a spectrum. We, both Charla and I, advocate a very pragmatic approach to research methods, and that is to say that whatever your research question is should dictate the methods that you use. And so while these categories that I'm about to go through tend to emerge and are almost like the stereotypes associated with each of these methodologies, there is deviations from these extremes. So to start off, we'll look at assumptions about the world. So this is ontology. How do we think that the world works? Well, from a quantitative perspective, they tend to focus on the idea that there's a single objective reality that we all experience, and those laws are capable of being discovered and tested, and once we answer all of the questions, we're essentially putting together the jigsaw puzzle of how the world works. Alternatively, a qualitative approach might see the world as much more socially constructed, and in fact, multiple social constructions of reality exist. So the world isn't so much a single answerable question, it's more a riddle that we each are trying to solve on our own. Assumptions about how the world can be known, which is your sort of beliefs about learning, is that we in quantitative research we focus on observable phenomena. We take this empiricist approach, we design experiments, we are very meticulous and procedure based, whereas in the qualitative world we focus on trying to describe perceptions and interpretations of situations and bringing a rich depth, detailed understanding of how one person to the next might experience a phenomenon. Axiology, this is your ideological orientation. And again, this would be one where I very much disagree that it's the case that you can put qualitative and quantitative into buckets. But it is possible that in the qualitative methodology, you may have an intention to reform the way the world works, whereas that will never really happen in quantitative. It's not about advancing agendas in quantitative research. It's about answering questions so that we have a better understanding of the laws and rules of the way the world works. And in qualitative inquiry, you can go down this path of being more of an activist and trying to change the way perceptions are formed and the way people believe the world works. So that's more of a ideological kind of an orientation, which I don't think comes up as often in educational research. When you talk about the aims that are sought with each of these kinds, I think these descriptions provide a pretty good basis for understanding the difference or the comparison of quantitative and qualitative. So again, this builds right off of the previous slide. We're searching for truth. We're trying to write the book that describes the world, the rules of how the world works. So truth-seeking is the primary focus, as opposed to qualitative inquiry, where we're acknowledging that there is no single truth. There's a myriad of perspectives, and we want to be able to bring everyone's perspective to the table to develop a better understanding of phenomena and how these things are interrelated. So again, there's this idea of testing theory versus developing theory, establishing facts versus developing sensitizing concepts, describing relationships between variables, which we've talked a lot about, versus describing multiple realities, and then the idea of predicting variables, so being able to create models that will allow you to be able to predict what's going to happen in the world. Moving on to dominant forms of logical reasoning. Again, this is where we pit deductive versus inductive, the idea of generating versus answering or testing previously generated theories. Qualitative and quantitative can also be described in terms of the way theory is placed in the research process. So theories are tested and confirmed. So we start with theories in quantitative research. We add to them by building in new variables, but we are oftentimes starting the process with a theory to test. Whereas in qualitative inquiry, we are potentially building that theory. We're generating it. Importance of context. This is an interesting one because we talked about how in quantitative inquiry we are trying to achieve generalizable results, things that we can say apply across all contexts, regardless of the situation. And the more experimental it becomes, the harder it is to actually generalize. And the qualitative methodology kind of gets rid of that burden, and it says, you know what? Because everyone has their own experience of the world, we don't necessarily want to generalize. We want to be able to say that this phenomena with these individuals is how it functions, how it looks, how it's characterized, and there's no burden to say that it generalizes beyond anyone who hasn't been involved in the study. We'll talk a little bit more about this idea, though, in the sense that we want our theories to generalize. We want to be able to build a theory that applies across the board, but we don't necessarily want our outcomes or our interpretations to generalize. So that comes up again later. So how do quantitative and qualitative methods differ in terms of how problems are formulated? Well, in quantitative, we talk about the idea of narrowing down to well-delineated questions and hypotheses, and I've kind of been gearing you towards that with this literature review assignment. You know, you start off with a broad problem, and you zero in by reviewing the literature to identify a specific research question and hypothesis, and then this informs your methods for data collection and your design, your entire research design. Whereas in qualitative inquiry, it might not be as simple. It might not be as detailed in terms of how it's described. You start with a foreshadowing of the problem, and it can be reformulated after data collection has begun. So there's this iterative process, whereas this is pretty much defined at the outset, and the methods play out from there in a very linear fashion. Research design and process differs in the sense that design is pre-established before data is collected, much like we just talked about. Emergent designs is the idea that we can change the way we're analyzing the data or collecting the data during the study. Criteria sought in the research design. These are the ideas of threats to internal validity. So we want representativeness of our sample. We want a large enough sample size. We want to control for extraneous variables. We want ethical acceptability, and we want the study to be feasible. Whereas in qualitative research design, we want to be producing something that's we want to have access and to involve participants who are knowledgeable and informative about our phenomena. So it's not so much about representativeness anymore. It's about very specific participants. We're trying to get saturation, so enough of those people involved. We want to be able to triangulate information from different sources, so not only from the participant's point of view, but potentially from others as well as yourself as a researcher. We do require ethical acceptability, and again, it's important to have feasibility, so there's some similarities there. Quantitative and qualitative methods differ in the way that the challenges that you can be confronted with while you're doing your research. So similar to what we just talked about, you want to be able to control for potential confounding variables, extraneous variables. We want to be able to have representative samples, and we want to make sure that we're measuring things validly. Alternatively, in qualitative, this is the idea of making sure people know the biases we bring to the table. So bracketing our preconceptions, being very clear about our expectations, our experiences that may inform the kinds of inferences that we're going to be making based on the analysis. And there's a real challenge in terms of reducing large amounts of data down to something that we can analyze. So if you imagine that you're studying even just focus groups or interview data, the amount of text that ends up emerging from a simple half-hour interview with 20 people is tremendous. Well, try imagining now bringing in documents and historical narratives or long-standing accessible minutes that have been established over years. That the amount of data can grow exponentially, and so how do you deal with that? Well, that's a very big challenge in qualitative research. Clearly, the focus in quantitative in terms of how we sample participants is we want to try and create a representative sample, so random sampling is ideal, but we know that for the purposes of most research, we're dealing with a sample of convenience. In qualitative, we're free of the burden of having a representative sample, but we have to be very purposive in terms of who we bring into our study. If we want to look at people who are successful in our respective disciplines, then we need to have a clear definition of what success means in our discipline and then try to find people who exemplify that. Researchers' relationship with the participants. So very much in quantitative methods, we are striving for detachment. We are trying to create situations where the participants don't even know they're being studied in some cases, but blinding the participant and the data collector to the conditions is something we talk about in order to try and clear up any bias that being studied might impact on the participants. Alternatively, in qualitative inquiry, there's this focus on immersing yourself into the data, immersing yourself into the case, the situation, the documents, because it's only through immersion that you'll be able to produce a strong or the strongest possible description of what it is people are experiencing. In quantitative research, we focus on observable behavior, and in qualitative research, we're looking at experiences of participants, and we're developing the meaning that others attach to participants' behavior. So we may be interviewing people who observe other people, but it's all about the experiences as opposed to simply things that you can observe. Tools for collecting data. We want to have standardized instruments, interviews, and observations that are very procedurally strong and clear and replicable. In qualitative inquiry, on the other hand, the researcher is the major instrument of data collection. The nature of the data, it's pretty obvious. We're dealing with numerical measurements of variables in quantitative research versus narrative descriptions of actions, feelings, and thoughts. And those can be in the form of interviews, focus groups, documents, emails, whatever it is we might have access to that is actually substantive narrative description. How do we analyze? How can we compare this? Well, analysis in quantitative is something that happens at the end of the process, and it really is all about describing relationships between variables, and we summarize our results statistically. With qualitative inquiry, we are analyzing the data very much on an ongoing basis. Written presentation of research. This is interesting because it is the case that if you're in the quantitative world, there's a lot of examples out there, exemplars that you can use to structure the way you write up your study. And so if you follow that format, you'll produce something that is widely accepted. Whereas in qualitative inquiry, very much the opposite is the case. It's not that there is a lot of it's not that there's a specific organization to a qualitative study that is the one right way of doing it. Very much the writing style becomes critical, and the way results are presented, and the way biases are described, and the way methods are presented can differ from one study to the next. Criteria for appraisal: were the measurements reliable in quantitative inquiry? Are the conclusions valid? Alternatively, in qualitative inquiry, is the research trustworthy and credible? Do we get a useful description from what's been done? Does it provide us with very persuasive or illuminating understandings of the phenomena of interest? And so it's a much different criteria for appraisal in the qualitative inquiry world. So once again, caveat is this isn't a black and white world. The research question dictates. You have to be careful to realize that quantitative and qualitative data can be analyzed from a qualitative perspective. So if you collect a bunch of interview data, you can do a quantitative analysis with them. And that isn't putting you in the category of doing qualitative research necessarily. However, as we'll talk about with mixed methods, the lines do end up blurring. You can be doing both simultaneously on qualitative data. So the book covers these very well, so I'm not going to spend much time on them. Phenomenology is this idea that everyone has their own reality and perception of their experiences, and so we're going to study a person's perceptions and experiences of a phenomena and try to describe them. Ethnography is where you're, as a researcher, you're setting yourself into a context, a culture, and you're on various levels immersing yourself and observing and trying to generate an understanding of how that culture or setting or context works. Case study research is a situation where you have multiple sources of narrative data that build a case, and so you may have interviews from multiple actors within a context, you may have focus groups, you may have even survey results, and that group of data forms a case which you can then study as a unit and do qualitative inquiry on. And you can have multiple cases that are either similar or contrasting. Grounded theory is the general qualitative inquiry where you're trying to build a theory. The theory is emerging from your analysis, so you're coding and categorizing qualitative snippets of data and generating a theory of how that phenomena functions and works that you may potentially want to apply to other individuals or to other situations. And narrative research is the study of again, it's similar to case study research in the sense that there has emerged a set of qualitative data sources that are speaking to a certain narrative, a certain conversation. And so it's the study of that group of qualitative sources of data and trying to understand the narrative that's emerging and trying to describe that more fully. So it's important that we talk about validity in qualitative research because it's obviously been so important to the quantitative research methods discussion we've been having. And you'd think it would be just as important, and it is, but it's a totally different kind of conversation. And the reason that is what we're dealing with here when we're evaluating validity of qualitative research isn't necessarily zeroing in on the methods and the details and asking ourselves, did they control for this? Is the sample representative? We're evaluating the outcome of the research. We're looking at the account that's been generated, the understanding of the phenomena, and the account that results is our primary focus for evaluation. And what that means, why we do that, is because we acknowledge that not all possible accounts of some individual situation, phenomena, activity, text, institution, or program are equally useful, credible, or legitimate. And so the description that emerges, the overall interpretation that a qualitative inquirer develops as a result of their analysis can differ in terms of its usefulness, its credibility, and legitimacy. And so validity of qualitative research is all about asking ourselves whether or not we trust or we think that that description of the account is good enough. So based on that foundational sort of understanding that we're evaluating the accounts, a fellow by the name of Maxwell came up with 5 types of validities that we might apply to qualitative research. And the first is descriptive validity. And this is that simple idea of, is the data that's been collected factually accurate? So we need to have evidence that the researcher is not making up or distorting the things they see or hear. We need to know whether or not the reports that the participant makes or that an informant makes are correct, that things were not misheard or mistranscribed or misremembered. And so it's about, how did that data get produced? How did those accounts, how did those narrative descriptions, those interviews actually get produced in order to be analyzed? Then it's not a focus on the interpretation at this point. It's a focus on simply the activities around collecting the data. And so this is where we turn to interpretive validity. Essentially, now we're trying to evaluate whether we trust the account's interpretation of the meaning and activities that have been described. So the participants that are being studied, they don't always know their own feelings, and they may recall them inaccurately. They may distort or conceal their views. And so how does the interpretation that the researcher comes up with actually account for all of this? And this is what we evaluate here. Theoretical validity refers to an account's function as an explanation as well as a description of or interpretation of the phenomenon. So is the account a valid theory of some phenomena? Are the concepts employed to characterize the phenomena valid? Are the postulated relationships between the concepts valid? So in contrast to descriptive and interpretive validity, where the issue is accuracy, in theoretical validity the issue is appropriateness. And so this is where other literature is often brought into the conversation, and we're judging whether or not we see an alignment or a match between the interpretation a person comes up with and the theory they're trying to build. So generalizability does make its way into the conversation of validity and qualitative inquiry. However, it's a little different. It's talking about whether or not that theory you develop can be generalized to similar types of situations or populations of persons. So it's not necessarily about whether our results will generalize to the universe of people that exist. It's more about how useful the theory that's being developed is in terms of describing the phenomena beyond just the people who happen to be involved in the study. So there are 2 types of generalizability, internal and external. Internal involves this generalizing within a community, group, or institution, and that can be very important and enlightening for program evaluation purposes, where you're trying to establish the particular culture of an institution or organization, and this would readily apply to a lot of faculties. But you don't think that whatever you develop for your faculty will necessarily apply to even other faculties in your similar discipline, because of the host of different factors that come into play in developing that specific culture for the context in Edmonton in this faculty or in that faculty. And so you can limit yourself to judging an account based on its internal generalizability for that context. Then, researchers might want to try to extend their generalizability to other communities or groups of institutions. And an example might be where you study multiple cases of faculties of medicine or nursing, for example, and you try to develop some general theory of how those institutions and those faculties develop a culture or the way their culture works. Finally, there's the idea of evaluative validity. This involves the application of an evaluative framework to the objects of the study. It's less central to qualitative inquiry than the first four, because many researchers don't actually try to evaluate the things they study. So it's where you have come in with a predetermined set of outcomes and you're trying to establish whether or not your research study has achieved those outcomes. And then program evaluation is the world where this applies most obviously. So how do qualitative researchers apply these concepts to their research and in evaluating other people's research, other qualitative research? Well, they do it in a much less direct way. Essentially, every account is unique and it brings its own questions about trustworthiness and what needs to be focused on in terms of validity. And so as you're developing a study, you're going to try to design your methods so that you eliminate these anticipated and even unanticipated biases, like in terms of descriptive validity and inferential validity. But what ends up happening is that the researcher explains their experiences that they're bringing to the table, the experiences that their participants are bringing to the table, and then very clearly tries to situate their interpretations and their descriptions of the account within those biases and allows those to be transparent so that as you're reading the results, you understand where they're coming from and can process them accordingly. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, let's watch this video first and then I'll try to summarize.
The Blind Man and the Elephant by John G. Sachs. It was 6 men of Indostan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, "God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall." The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, "Ho, what have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp. To me 'tis very clear, this wonder of an elephant is very like a spear." The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up he spake, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a snake." The fourth reached out his eager hand, and felt about the knee. "What most this wondrous beast is like is very plain," quoth he, "'tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree." The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, "E'en the blindest man can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can? This marvel of an elephant is very like a fan." The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a rope." And so these men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong.
Okay, and so The Blind Man and the Elephant is a really interesting and great example of why we need to evaluate the accounts that we generate with qualitative inquiry. And we also sort of use it as a basis to justify the need for qualitative inquiry. If we assume that every researcher is a blind man and they're using their own particular tools in order to study a phenomenon or question, they're all going to miss something, and we might all come up with different answers to the question. That's where standardization comes in, and if we all use the same instruments, everything will be fine. But the reality is, there's likely to be something that's missed out in even the instruments we do choose to use. So in comes qualitative inquiry, which says that, let's disencumber ourselves from the idea that we need to find the one true reality and the answer to the question. Let's focus on the fact that there are multiple perceptions, multiple accounts that can be generated about a phenomenon, and let's use those for what they are, and try to learn from them for what they are. And eventually we may develop multiple accounts of similar phenomena that give us a better understanding of that phenomena in general. And that's useful in and of itself. It doesn't necessarily have to be the be-all, end-all answer to the story. So this is an interesting story, and I think it relates really well to what we are trying to do with qualitative inquiry. It's acknowledging that everyone comes to the equation with a different perspective, and they can produce unique accounts, and we should be judging those accounts for what they are, not necessarily for how they compare to each other. Here are some other useful resources for qualitative inquiry. I've mentioned Maxwell, and there's a few other ones here, but I'll post the slides and you can take a look at these if you're interested. One final note, qualitative inquiry and research methods is a very intensive area of research methodology, and if you are planning on doing this kind of research for your thesis, I'd encourage you to follow up with further training based on the kind of method that you're considering using.